Welcome to another edition of AP World History at University High School. This is part two of the Cold War timeline notes. So you're filling in the blanks as you're going on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side, you're taking detailed notes. So we left off in 1954, and let me get the timeline side by side here. So I'll flip back and forth so I know where I'm at on here as well. So right here, in 1954, let's see. Indochina was a colony of France, right? And today it's made up of three countries, and that's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But during World War II, the Japanese took over that part of the world, as well as Indonesia, much of Southeast Asia, the Philippines. Anyway, after World War II, the French tried to reassert control of Indochina. But the trend after World War II in many parts of Asia and Africa is independence, decolonization. And the movement there for independence, they technically called themselves the nationalists, but they were communists, communist nationalists, if you will, was led by this man. His name is Ho Chi Minh, who had a socialist Marxist vision for a future Vietnam. And so he begins to with guerrilla forces, meaning using like unconventional warfare, began to resist the French, and a long war for independence began there. The French fought for about 7 or 8 years, and they committed over 150,000 troops, but a lot of them died. A lot of them were French colonial troops from Africa, also from Vietnam. Something like 92,000 of them have died, until eventually there was just a disaster for the French army where they got bogged down, French forces did, in this valley, and they were just getting picked apart and picked apart by Ho Chi Minh's forces. His forces were called the Viet Minh. So Viet and then Minh, his last name there. And that place was called Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu. It was kind of like the last major loss for the French forces in Vietnam. And when they lost at Dien Bien Phu, immediately the next day was announced a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, to determine what to do about this part of the world, Vietnam. And the attendants were the USSR, China, the People's Republic of China, of the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh, the French, Americans, British. And what was determined is that the country would be split in two. Here is the DMZ, a demilitarized zone. North of that is going to be, it's the 17th parallel, by the way, is going to be a government controlled by Ho Chi Minh, and it was going to be communist. And south of that, a non-communist government, kind of democratic, like they do have elections. And in 1956, there was supposed to be an election that would probably unify the two countries under whatever the results of the election were. However, the leader of the South at the time, his name was Diem, D-I-E-M, backed out of those elections in 1956. And when that happened, fighting broke out again. So after Dien Bien Phu, by the way, the French withdraw. So there's no more French, like strong presence here, and they're no longer trying to control it as a colony anymore. So Vietnam is independent, but the question now is it going to be communist or is it going to be non-communist? This guy Ho Chi Minh definitely wants it to become communist. So let's move on. So here are pictures from 1954 in Dien Bien Phu, where it fell to communist forces, and then after that, this civil war in Vietnam broke out between communists and non-communists there. The United States and other powers would get involved. That's what the Cold War is this global fight for communism or capitalism and democracy by the Soviet Union and the United States. Let's move on to 1955. So we know that in 1948, 49, whenever it was, NATO was created. 49. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that's what you see in blue. Here's NATO in 1949, 52, 55. Just go up to 55 because Spain, you can see, joined in 82, and that's when the fascist rule of Franco ended. So it's where it is in 1982. You've got all the stuff in blue. Those are non-communist countries here in the Atlantic, very important players. And in 1955, the Soviet Union leads the creation of this counterpart to NATO, you could say. So NATO is a military alliance, right? An attack on one NATO nation is an attack on all NATO nations. Well, the Warsaw Pact was the same thing, but it was for the Soviet Union and these satellite states, right, in Eastern Europe, these satellites. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. And you can see how polarized, increasingly polarized the world is becoming. These purple dots are Soviet military bases. You can see they're not just in the Soviet Union, but they're all over those Eastern Bloc countries. Same thing for U.S. military bases. Britain, France, Germany, Turkey, U.S. military bases all over the Atlantic and Mediterranean there. In 56, the new premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, he's going to deliver the secret speech to the Politburo. The Politburo is it's kind of like the Soviet parliament, if you will. The secret speech denouncing Stalin. And he ushers in a policy that he calls de-Stalinization. That rule by fear that Stalin had instituted in the Soviet Union was going to be, ended. Does that mean that the Soviet Union is becoming more liberalized? To an extent, yes, a little bit, but still definitely you can't challenge the ideas of the state. You can't publish things that criticize the state and the party, that is, the Communist Party. All right, let's move on to 1956. So the Cold War, let's define it again. The Cold War is this long, protracted struggle. That means it's over a long period of time, for about 50 years. It's an ideological conflict. That is the key word there. Because it doesn't always get into a real physical hot war, if you will. It's an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States and all of their allies that utilizes all sorts of methods. Propaganda, assassinations, financial aid, military aid, sometimes committing troops to certain places in the world. So one of these places that the United States was focusing on a great deal was Eastern Europe. So it's very key that you remember here that the Cold War, for the purposes of AP World History, is not about the United States, and it's not even kind of about the Soviet Union. It's more about how other parts of the world are affected, like Southeast Asia, like Sub-Saharan Africa, like Eastern Europe. How are they affected by the Cold War? So the United States helps fund these radio broadcasts from free Western Europe into communist Eastern Europe, because they were closed off from the West and didn't get any information or anything like that. But if you had a short wave radio, you could hear broadcasts in Eastern Europe from free Western Europe, and oftentimes there'd be propaganda there about, like, I don't know, what sucks about communism and what's great about the West. And that partially contributed to this uprising in Budapest, Hungary, which is a communist country, in 1956. Budapest. So it was an armed uprising, but it wasn't like a military coup or anything like that. It was people who took to the streets, got control of the radio station and some government buildings, and they said, we're a free country now. America, please come send assistance and stuff. The United States did not, and they did not for one main reason. Now, maybe, well, a lot of reasons, but the Warsaw Pact, right? Because if they intervene in that country, the Warsaw Pact says that an attack on one member nation of the Warsaw Pact is an attack on all. And here's, a smashed statue of Stalin. The prime minister of Hungary at the time, Imre Nagy, he stood by and kind of watched this stuff happen, didn't use the Hungarian military to crush this uprising, and thereby kind of like allowing it to happen, right? So what did happen? The Soviet Union sent in forces to crush the uprising. So there you go. And they said they used that justification of the Warsaw Pact. They executed all the leaders of this uprising. The United States did not intervene for fear of creating a larger conflict. And the Prime Minister, Imre Nagy, he was executed as well. A huge event happens in 1957. It's not really all that significant in itself, but what it symbolizes is very significant. The Soviet Union launches the first man-made object into orbit around planet Earth, and that is a satellite called Sputnik, Sputnik 1. I'm not sure exactly what it did. Maybe it was like a weather satellite or who knows what. That was not important, but because Americans were very afraid. What can this thing do? Take pictures of you in your backyard, drop things on your head, who knows? What it did definitely signal in the United States is that they were behind the Soviet Union now technologically, which is unacceptable. And what it eventually led to, contributed to, what was already happening was an arms race, but it further contributed to this arms race, and it further contributed in the United States to heavy investments in science and math technology. So what you see here is beginning after, look at after 1957, the total U.S. inventory of, I think it's not nuclear weapons because that would be really big, but it's some kinds of weapons of mass destruction. Oh, here we go, the warheads. These are probably nuclear warheads. So you can see how it increases dramatically as a result of this. NASA was also created after 1957, so this begins the space race, you could say, between the two, as well as the arms race. So the total nuclear stockpile, and I believe this is of the United States, you can see how it skyrockets after 1957, probably because of the fears of, of Sputnik. Let's see, where are we? USSR launches Sputnik in May 1960. The American pilot Gary Powers is shot down over Russia, over the Soviet Union in 1960. This is a spy plane. This is a really big deal. Imagine that the United States had shot down a Soviet spy plane over Colorado or something. That's scary. That's a big deal. And this further increased the tensions between the two powers, between the U.S. and USSR. This is not on your timeline. You have to put it on your timeline. It's very important. 90 miles off the coast of the United States is the island of Cuba. America had long had important dealings in Cuba. First of all, they quote-unquote freed it from Spanish rule in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, and they did not claim it as a territory or a colony. Instead, they gave Cuba independence, but the United States maintained a lot of control and influence in Cuba for decades to come. They controlled a lot of the plantations there, probably the telephone companies and things like that, so there was a lot of American investment in the country. The president of Cuba was a guy named Fulgencio Bautista, and he was supported by the American government, but he was considered pretty corrupt in Cuba. Anyway, this coup, this military coup, overthrew Bautista, and it was led by communists, led by Fidel Castro. So for them, America was considered, like an evil imperialistic nation. So Bautista fled to Florida. Fidel Castro began to establish a communist government there. What did they do? They nationalized plantations, tobacco and sugar plantations. Everything began to be run by the state. So this is going to begin a long period of tension and animosity between the United States and Cuba. So a communist country just 90 miles off the coast of the United States now. You can see communism is spreading. And so the U.S. is actually going to try to assassinate Castro a couple of times. And this was his kind of his right-hand man here, literally. His name is Che Guevara. That was a nickname, Ernesto Guevara. He was Argentinian, technically. You should watch The Motorcycle Diaries. It's a pretty interesting little biography of Che Guevara. It's a movie. Okay, but in 1961, the United States sponsors this invasion called the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. So it's these few thousand Cuban exiles. Well, they took off to Florida because they didn't want to be under communist government. They were trained by the United States CIA in Cuba, and they were going to invade Cuba here. Or excuse me, they were trained in Florida, and they were going to invade here and overthrow Castro's regime. It failed, and it failed partially because the United States ended up pulling their air support for these rebels, or for these, whatever, I don't know what you can call them, invaders. And so this attempted coup of Castro failed. Tensions further increased as a result between Cuba and the United States, and an embargo existed on trade between Cuba and the United States. An embargo, so no buying and selling between these two countries. That is still in effect today. But the military base that the United States had gotten at Guantanamo Bay way back with the Spanish-American War in 1898, that was still there. And it's still there today. 1961, a crisis in the city of Berlin. These are American tanks, I believe, I'm pretty sure. The Americans still maintain troops in Berlin because remember that city is inside now communist East Germany, and Berlin is going to become the symbol of the Cold War. Not only that, but in Berlin, the Soviets begin the East Germans, you could say, but under Soviet direction, begin to build a wall. They build a wall right down the middle of the city of Berlin. Why? To keep people from coming in? No, to keep people from fleeing. People were fleeing from East Germany into West Germany through the city of East Berlin by the thousands every single year. So they constructed this wall, and it became like a physical now symbol of the bipolarization of Europe and of communism and versus capitalism. And there it stood for 28 years, yeah, right in front of the famous Brandenburg Gates in the city of Berlin. A couple of presidents are going to give famous speeches there. First, John F. Kennedy in 1962 or 63, and then President Reagan in the mid 80s, standing firm with the Berliners. Okay, October 1962 is arguably the most tense event of the Cold War ever. This is possibly the closest the world ever came to nuclear annihilation. So what happened in 1962 is that the Soviet Union, they had been sending a lot of financial and material aid to the Castro regime to support them, obviously. That's pretty important for the Soviets, a communist country right off the coast of the United States. But then when the Soviet Union began to place nuclear warheads, and the Americans figured this out because of spy planes, but nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba that could reach any major city in the United States, with the exception of Seattle, actually, but any other major city in the entire country could be reached by these nuclear warheads. That led to this standoff between the two nations. The United States said, you have to remove these or else, and the or else was that they would remove them by force, that is by airstrikes. And if that happened, then the Soviets would have to attack somewhere else, and most likely that would have been at Berlin. And if that happened in Berlin, the United States would have escalated, and escalation might have meant nuclear weapons, and if nuclear weapons would have been used, then the Soviets would have used them in return, and it's like a point of no return. That's why you can see both these men sweating. And who are they? Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union and the President of the United States at the time, John F. Kennedy. So the U.S. Plan was that they were going to blockade the island of Cuba. So they blockaded it, and they forced every Soviet ship that was coming to the island, they forced them away. They even fired shots across the bow of some ships as like warning shots. And it succeeded. Ships began to turn around. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles if the United States removed some other, not nuclear warheads, but some other missiles from Turkey. So the event was, it nearly came to the brink of nuclear warfare. It was 13 of the most tense days of the century, but nuclear holocaust was averted. Okay. Where are we here? 1964. Why did I put this in here? I don't know why I put this picture in here. Oh, this shows you Cold War economic alliances as well, but not that significant. So 1964, possibly because the Soviets kind of flinched first in that game of chicken with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, was ousted. He was forced out by party leaders. And the new leader of the Soviet Union from 1964 until his death in 1982 is this guy, Leonid Brezhnev. Leonid Brezhnev. Yeah, he's kind of a bit more of a hardliner. Let's return to Vietnam. In 1965, well, between 1956 and 1965, there's already fighting in this country of Vietnam. Between whom? Between the communists in the north, their capital is at Hanoi there, and the Ho Chi Minh forces, those are the communists, and the non-communists. I cannot call them necessarily democratic because Diem was considered pretty corrupt as well, and kind of fixed some elections, that is, rigged some elections. So the communists basically want to create a unified Vietnam. Well, both sides do, but is it going to be a communist government or a non-communist government? This is important as well. The Chinese, that's the most populous country on earth, and that's a communist country under Mao Zedong, right? They gave military assistance. There weren't really Chinese troops in Vietnam, but military assistance to the North Vietnamese. And that's significant as well, because the United States figures, hey, we've got to do something to stop that as well. This is something, this is definitely part of the containment theory again, right? Containment, you have to remember that word. And the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is no longer, I mean, Truman is no longer around, but the doctrine is there, containment. And a belief that if Vietnam falls, many of the other countries in Southeast Asia are going to fall. It's called the domino theory. The domino theory. And so in 1965, the United States began to commit ground troops there. How do they do it? Just because? No, I mean, there was like an American ship up here in the Gulf of Tonkin was attacked by a North Vietnamese torpedo, or at least that's what the American military claimed. The president at the time, President Lyndon Johnson, because JFK had been assassinated, went to Congress and he told them what happened, and I need money to send troops to Vietnam because we were attacked, and they did. And that was the first year that the United States committed ground troops to Vietnam. It would be the beginning of a really long conflict because they figured, hey, they're going to wipe out the communists pretty easily, but that didn't happen. It was in the jungle. There were a lot of booby traps. The communists came in through Laos. You see this in the Mekong River. You see the Mekong River out here. They came in through Cambodia. The United States was forced to bomb throughout Laos. They invaded Cambodia as well, trying to get at these Viet Minh and North Vietnamese forces. And that just dragged the United States military more and more and more and more into this conflict. They began to commit more and more troops. And it was the longest war in American history until the war in Afghanistan passed it up recently. Okay, got to move on to 1968. In 1968, something similar to what happened in Hungary and Budapest in 1956 happened. So 56, Hungary, 68, Czechoslovakia. This is Alexander Dubček. Alexander Dubček, who was the prime minister, I think, of Czechoslovakia at the time. Led by him, the government in Czechoslovakia began to pass a number of reforms, liberal-type reforms, meaning liberal in the sense of, the opposite of communism here. More freedoms of speech, freedoms of things like that, and probably more democratic type reforms. It was called the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring. What happened there, and these were like democratically elected. Well, democratically elected. There's only one party in Czechoslovakia at the time, probably the Communist Party. But the Soviets once again brought in tanks to remove Alexander Dubček. Dubček, by the way, is D-U-B-C-E-K. D-U-B-C-E-K. Remove him from power. Probably removed a number of the parliamentarians as well because they were not excited about these reforms that were being implemented in Czechoslovakia. So even when it's done in a peaceful way like this, the Soviet Union came in and removed those people from power. And a lot of this was a student-led movement, and that's what you see here. It was just a popular movement of the people. This lady's got a picture, I think, of Dubček there as Russian and also Czech forces. Some of these might have been Czech as well, Czechoslovak rather. Back then it was one country. You see they're waving their Czechoslovak flag. They'd flip this car over, but nothing doing. Their government was gutted, basically. So all those reforms were undone. Did get violent a little bit as well. Okay. 1972 is a massively important year, you could say. You'll learn more about this in U.S. history. The reason it's so significant is because the United States paid a visit to China. President Nixon did. This is very significant because the United States had refused to even recognize that the People's Republic of China was China. We'd only been recognizing Taiwan as the Republic of China. In fact, even in the UN, China on their Security Council, they were represented by Taiwan, not by China. So here's President Nixon and the basically second in command, Zhou Enlai in China. He's on the Great Wall there, and this did not yet formally, like officially on paper, open up diplomatic and economic relations with the United States. Not yet, but it was the first big step towards that. And the reason that's significant is because with the next guy, because Mao's still in power, remember this is 72, but he dies in 76. With the next guy, they're going to take a step, China is, towards re-entering the world economy, towards the market economy. So here's President Nixon with Mao shaking hands, 1972. Mao didn't come to the United States, however. Nixon again with Zhou Enlai. Nixon playing badminton. I wonder if he was any good. I was pretty good in high school. King of the court. So that's 72. All it was a visit, but its symbolic importance is really important because remember, before 72, before the 70s, China's one of the worst places on earth. Cultural Revolution, and before that, the Great Leap Forward with the biggest famine in history. After the late 70s, they're going to re-enter the world economy, and now you guys are using stuff and wearing stuff and eating stuff, sometimes even made in China. All that happened, you could say, partially because of this. Okay, in 1972, SALT I. No, this is a picture of SALT II, probably. SALT means Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. That means that the Soviet Union here, and this is President Jimmy Carter, so this must be probably SALT II because he was president in the late 70s. The Soviet Union and the United States are going to agree to start limiting their stockpile of nuclear weapons. They're going to limit their stockpile of nuclear weapons. That's a pretty big step, and this begins in the early 70s, and it's going to be the trend after that, late 70s, and then throughout the 80s, as the Soviet Union becomes, in some ways, less hardline. Okay, in 1973, finally, after just 8 years of brutal, nasty fighting, 60,000 Americans, something like 60,000 Americans had died in Vietnam. Millions of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians died in the war as well, and a lot of it was some pretty brutal weapons. This is one of the most famous photographs of the Vietnam War. Because public opinion in the United States greatly turned against the Vietnam War, because partially because of how many Americans were dying, but also because of the brutality of the war. Americans were using a weapon called napalm, which is it's like this jelly stuff or liquid stuff that is very, very, very flammable. So this little girl is actually covered in napalm, and she's kind of on fire. Her skin is anyway. Also, this is a South Vietnamese, so that's the American ally, right? Officer executing a guerrilla fighter, a communist guerrilla fighter. And this was a video. Every American saw this on CBS's nightly news. And so public opinion was really against the war, and they were horrified at what they saw. These are Buddhist monks self-immolating, that is, they're setting themselves on fire. And they were protesting the government of South Vietnam, actually, because it was so corrupt and repressive towards Buddhists. So this is obviously very graphic and very horrifying, and Americans saw this as well on their TV screens. So many said, get the helicopters out of Vietnam. You'll learn more about this next year in U.S. history. So 1973, the United States pulls out of Vietnam. This is the 1973 was the ceasefire. What you're looking at here is another famous photograph in 1975, because in 1975, the North Vietnamese Communist forces overran all of South Vietnam. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, which is this image here. This is the evacuation of the United States Embassy in Saigon. It is renamed Ho Chi Minh. The city is Ho Chi Minh now today, and now the rest is history. There is Ho Chi Minh, and all Vietnam communists today, however, economically not really communist. This is the last. I think we'll stop here. 1976, Vietnam is unified as a communist country. 1978, of incredible importance, China opens itself up to the world market economy. This is President Jimmy Carter and Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. 1978 is the critical year there for China. We'll stop there and pick it up in the next chapter. Thank you for coming.